This video is brought to you by Athletic Greens and its wonderful daily blend of vitamins and minerals. AG1 by Athletic Greens is a comprehensive all-in-one greens powder engineered to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet and support your body's nutritional needs across 4 pillars of health: gut health, immune support, energy, and recovery. It's packed with 75 vitamins and minerals and whole food sourced ingredients, combining the perfect amount of micronutrients, absorption, and taste to jumpstart your daily routine. You'll be hard-pressed to find a more comprehensive powder or supplement on the market right now. Now look, as you guys know, I'm not exactly a fitness YouTuber, but I still do like to eat right and take care of myself, and AG1 is that comprehensive nutrition supplement that I know is going to account for any holes that I might have in my diet. You just take 1 scoop from this and you put it in this bottle shaker every day with the powder, and easy. Shake it up. I have it in the morning, typically with my coffee. And it also tastes great. Plus, it's gluten-free, dairy-free, paleo, vegan, keto, low allergen, and low calorie, less than 1 gram of sugar in there. One of the things I like about it, I feel it gives me more sustained energy. Like I drink that coffee, I have my Athletic Greens, and I feel set up for the day. It's the perfect dietary support regimen. So if this sounds like the supplement you've been looking for, then you can grab your own immunity bundle, which also contains a year's supply of vitamin D and 5 of these super handy travel pouches. So you can have your AG1 while on the go. These come free with your first purchase. So all you need to do is go to athleticgreens.com/biographics. Again, year's supply of vitamin D, the 5 travel pouches at athleticgreens.com/biographics, or just click the link in the description below. And now today's video. In 1876, the United States was gearing up to celebrate the 100th anniversary of its founding. The country needed to celebrate. An economic depression had gripped the nation for the last 3 years. There was controversy and scandal surrounding the administration of President Ulysses S. Grant, and hanging over everyone were the unhealed scars of the recently concluded Civil War. Then, from the West, word came of a military disaster. In faraway Montana Territory, in a place called the Little Bighorn, over 250 troopers of the Army's 7th Cavalry Regiment had been killed in a fight with hostile Indians. Most shocking of all, though, was the fact that the regiment's famed commander, Colonel George Custer, was among the dead. At the time, Custer was one of the most famous men in America. He'd been a Northern hero during the Civil War, famous for his dramatic cavalry charges and responsible for some of the Union's biggest victories. After the war, he became the country's most famous Indian fighter, due just as much to his own propensity for self-promotion as for his military skill. He'd also been involved in a number of scandals that would have destroyed his military career had he been anybody else, but he always managed to find a way out, a remarkable streak of good fortune that contemporaries know as Custer's luck. Now that luck had run out, but it seemed in death, Custer was even more famous than he was alive. The dramatic last stand made by him and his cavalrymen was almost immediately compared to the story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, with Custer taking on the role of the Spartan king Leonidas. For decades, Custer was held up as an American martyr to the winning of the West, a hero without peer. A more recent analysis has been more critical, however, not only of his active participation in the shameful actions taken by the American government against the Indian tribes of the Great Plains, but also for his reckless, impulsive decisions, many of which got people killed. George Armstrong Custer was born on December 5th, 1839 in New Rumley, Ohio, a tiny and remote farming community located 100 miles south of the city of Cleveland. The Custers were a large, hard-working family with a lot of love to go around. George, nicknamed Auntie because he kept mispronouncing his middle name when he was a toddler, was an outgoing boy who liked to read and was a decent student compared to his peers. At the age of 16, he graduated from primary school and briefly became a school teacher until he achieved what he had declared to be his life's ambition, an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York, the training ground for the nation's army officers. Cadet Custer's record at West Point from 1857 to 1861 is legendary for all the wrong reasons. One of the most popular students in his class, it seemed wherever there was a mischief going on, Custer could be found right in the middle of it. He enjoyed pushing boundaries and testing the limits of authority. He was always in trouble for something, racking up 726 demerits during his first 4 years at the academy, one of the worst disciplinary records in the history of the school. Academically, he was a firm believer in the philosophy, C's get degrees. He'd do the bare minimum to pass the classes, never studying if he could avoid it. He'd prefer to do things that interested him instead. Sometimes these interests got him into trouble too. He was treated with gonorrhea in his junior year, probably contracted from a New York prostitute. With all these shenanigans during his time at West Point, it seems a near miracle that he managed to graduate at all. but he did. Dead last. Under normal circumstances, this would not have boded well for his future prospects in the army, and it is likely nobody would have ever heard of George Armstrong Custer. But these were not normal circumstances. When Custer graduated in June 1861, the Civil War was already 2 months old, and the Union Army needed all the qualified officers it could get. Custer was spat out by the Academy almost directly onto the battlefield. Less than a month after graduating, Custer was on hand to witness the Union disaster at the First Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the war, and a stinging defeat for the North. Custer would next see action in March 1862, now a cavalry officer in the newly reorganized Army of the Potomac under the command of Major General George McClellan. McClellan's Peninsula Campaign that spring failed due to his own timidity and the emergence of Confederate General Robert E. Lee to leadership of the rebel Army of Northern Virginia, but Custer fought well, catching the attention of McClellan, who promoted him to aide-de-camp. When McClellan was fired by President Abraham Lincoln that November, Custer found himself out of a job for a few months. His next assignment was as aide to General Alfred Pleasonton, the commander of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps. At the end of June 1863, Pleasonton received permission to remove so-called political generals, politicians playing at war who weren't actually good at it, with professionals willing to risk their lives leading their units. One of the officers he believed fit that bill was Captain Custer. Only 2 years after graduating from the academy at the tender age of 23, Custer was promoted to Brigadier General, a truly meteoric rise for a man that his troops would call the Boy General. Custer was given command of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, known as the Wolverines. The first assignment was crucial. Robert E. Lee's army had invaded the northern states, marching through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, hoping to trap the Union Army and destroy it. The Army of the Potomac, now commanded by George Meade, followed, making sure that they stayed between Lee and the federal capital, Washington, D.C. The two armies would crash into each other on the 1st of July, 1863, at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. On the morning of July the 3rd, 1863, General Custer's brigade was posted 3 miles east of the Union infantry lines. They had seen sporadic fighting over the last 2 days as the infantry slugged away at each other in the bloodiest battle of the entire war. Both generals were warned that a large body of rebel cavalry was in the area, and they prepared to fight. Rebel cavalry, commanded by the famous General Jeb Stuart, emerged from the trees 6,000 strong, more than twice the number of Union troops. Stuart's mission was to support the infantry assault on the Union position led by General George Pickett. To do that, he needed to break through the Union cavalry. After 3 hours of fighting, Custer's men still held, and Stuart knew if he was going to accomplish his mission, he needed to attack now with everything he had. Thousands of mounted horsemen rode at the Yankees in a wave of cavalry that would have scared most commanders, but not George Custer. Despite being dramatically outnumbered, Custer wouldn't yield the field without a fight. The young general rode to the head of his men, drew his saber, knocked his hat off his head so everyone could recognize his distinctive long flowing blonde hair, and shouted, "Come on, you Wolverines!" And then he charged straight at the rebels. The leading ranks of both sides crashed into each other with tremendous force, sending horses toppling to the ground, end over end, crushing their riders. All organizational cohesion was lost as the battle collapsed into a confused melee, individual troopers slashing at each other with their sabers or firing on each other with pistols at point-blank range. More Union cavalry struck the Confederates in their flanks in support of Custer's attack, and the rebel attack fizzled out. Soon enough, Stuart received the news that Pickett's charge had failed, was repulsed with heavy losses, and he ordered his troopers back. The fight at the East Cavalry Field, as it would become known, was over. Overnight, General Custer was a household name, a hero lauded by both his supporters and the northern newspapers. It was, perhaps, his finest hour. Custer commanded the Michigan Cavalry Brigade with great distinction for the rest of the war, participating in several more major engagements. In April 1865, he was the first Union general to receive a flag of truce from the rebels as their position became hopeless. He was present at Appomattox when General Lee formally surrendered his army, effectively ending the war. In recognition for his service to the Union victory, Custer's commander, General Philip Sheridan, purchased the table the two generals had used to sign the Articles of Surrender and presented it to Custer's new wife, Elizabeth, known as Libby. Custer entered the war as a major general and a hero to the victorious North. He was only 25 years old. Obviously, great things were in his future. There was, however, one looming problem. With the war over, the Grand Army of the Republic was being broken up, its soldiers sent home to resume their civilian lives. The peacetime army was to be much, much smaller than the 2 million men mustered during the war, and for those professional officers that wished to remain in the army, Well, the fact was, there were simply more generals than there were slots to employ them. So George Custer, who once commanded thousands, found himself a lieutenant colonel in command of a single cavalry regiment, the 7th United States Cavalry. Garrison duty in western forts was a far cry from glorious cavalry charges on Civil War battlefields. His soldiers were not the idealistic volunteers he commanded before, but poor immigrants who were often the only ones willing to accept the low pay and dismal conditions that the army offered, and they all increasingly grew to dislike Custer. The man was not transitioning well to his loss of rank and responsibility and started taking it out on his subordinates with random outbursts of temper and often blurring the lines between strict discipline and outright cruelty. His erratic behavior ended in 1867 when he was court-martialed for being absent without leave from his post and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was suspended without pay for a year, which seems harsh until you consider that if it had been any other officer, he would have been dismissed from the army entirely. His war record and his powerful friends in the high command allowed him to get away with a slap on the wrist. It's not the last time this occurs in his career. In 1868, the American Indian tribes on the Great Plains were growing increasingly tired of the US government's failed promises to keep white settlers out of territory promised to them by treaties. Tribes like the Lakota and the Cheyenne began raiding white settlements, fighting back against what they saw as encroachments on their land and their way of life. Unfortunately, this gave the government pretext for war against the hostile savages, as most whites of the time period believed them to be. That winter, George Sheridan planned an operation designed to force the Southern Cheyenne bands onto designated reservations, which would open up other land for white settlement. The fact that these lands were far away from the buffalo herds that the Plains tribes relied on was not a consideration. One of the Cheyenne bands that was not yet on the reservation was a group of about 200 led by Chief Black Kettle, survivor of the massacre of over 150 peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho at Sand Creek 4 years earlier. Despite his negative past with whites, Black Kettle was widely known as a peace chief who did not want war, but some of his younger warriors, known as Dog Soldiers, would not be restrained and went out on raids. The 7th Cavalry found the tracks of one of these raiding parties and followed them back to Black Kettle's winter encampment along the banks of the Washita River in modern-day western Oklahoma. On November 27, 1868, Custer attacked the camp in accordance with Sheridan's strategy to destroy the Cheyenne's livestock and shelters and force them to surrender and move to the reservation, a total war strategy that had been greatly successful in the South during the Civil War. The action of Washita, which has been called both a battle and a massacre, sparked controversy both in 1868 and today. The reported number of Cheyenne dead ranges from 20 to over 100. Nobody will ever know for sure. The dead included Black Kettle, shot in the back while trying to flee from the village with his wife. At least some of those killed were women and children, and one of the controversies over the action is whether they were caught in the crossfire or whether they were deliberately targeted by the troopers. Particularly controversial was the decision by Custer to take over 50 women and children prisoner to use as human shields, preventing the warriors from firing on the cavalry as they departed for fear of hitting their own family members. Various atrocities were reported against these captives, supposedly in retribution for similar outrages committed on white settlements. Whatever the opinion about the action itself, Custer's reputation remained intact. There was a lull in military operations after Washita as the regiment was transferred first to Kentucky and then to the Dakota Territory. Custer tried his hand at a number of business ventures during this downtime, all of which were failures, except for writing about his exploits in newspapers, and he eventually published a book called My Life on the Plains. Despite growing complaints from his subordinates, he still had the trust of his superiors, continuing to receive important assignments like leading an expedition into the Black Hills region of South Dakota in 1874. This expedition, though Custer had no idea at the time, proved to be the start of the final drama in his colorful life. The Black Hills were explicitly included in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 as part of the reservation of the Lakota or Sioux people. Thus, technically, Custer's expedition was a violation of the treaty, though officials didn't think it would pose a significant issue because the troops didn't intend to stay. Everything changed, however, when Custer reported that his expedition had found gold there, and once leaked to the newspapers, it set off a wave of excitement. A gold rush soon took shape, with prospectors flooding into the area in the hopes of striking it rich. The army tried to keep them out, but conflict with the Lakota soon broke out. With the country in a depression since 1873, President Ulysses S. Grant knew that an influx of gold would be a much-needed boost to the economy. His officials made an attempt to purchase the Black Hills from the Lakota, but they refused to sell. The Black Hills were sacred to them, the place they believed the spirits had first created the world. It was the center of their entire universe, and how could you put a monetary value on that? The Americans decided they were just going to take the Black Hills instead, but once again they needed a pretext for a war with the Lakota. They found it in the lands west of the Great Sioux Reservation in Montana and Wyoming, where many of the Lakota and Cheyenne still followed after the buffalo like they had for generations, irrespective of arbitrary lines on a map. The government and the army decided to force these bands onto the reservation, knowing that they would resist and that it would lead to open war. The government sent word to the Indians in the unceded lands that they were required to move by January 31st, 1876, or be considered hostile. The deadline was a sham and everyone knew it. Even if the bands in question had been inclined to move, they would have been unable to until spring thaw. When the deadline passed, General Sheridan enacted his war plan. Troop columns moved into the area from the west, east, and south, hoping to trap hostile bands in a pincer. Custer and the 7th Cavalry were part of the Dakota Column, which left Fort Abraham Lincoln in North Dakota and headed west into Montana in May 1876. All three columns were to converge in the area of the Bighorn and Little Bighorn rivers in southern Montana, where it was believed that the largest concentration of Indian encampments were. They were more right than they realized. On the banks of the Little Bighorn was the largest Plains Indian camp in living memory. Every warrior who wanted to fight the whites had gathered in one place, drawn by the leadership of Lakota Chief Sitting Bull, who was believed to be a powerful medicine man whose visions foretold a great Indian victory over the whites. The warriors were a mix of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, numbering between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors, twice as many as pre-war government estimates. Custer and the 7th Cavalry detached from the rest of the column to scout ahead, and they found this village early on the morning of June the 25th. Despite being warned by his Crow and Arikara scouts about the size of the village, Custer still believed that he was facing no more than 800, including non-combatants like women and children. He decided not to wait for reinforcements because he believed had been spotted and was worried the various bands would scatter. He believed the Indians would run away when he attacked, another flawed assumption. Custer split his regiment, numbering about 700 men, into battalions for the attack. He himself led 5 companies to ride around the village and attack from the north, while 3 companies under the command of Major Marcus Reno attacked from the south. Reno soon found himself heavily engaged by far more warriors than he'd been expecting and was compelled to retreat to a hilltop, where he was joined by 3 companies led by Captain Frederick Benteen, who had been similarly overwhelmed while trying to support Custer. This group found itself surrounded, fighting for its life over the course of the next 2 days, before the approach of the rest of the Dakota Column compelled Sitting Bull to disband the encampment, and the various bands headed off in different directions. It was only then, on June the 27th, that his comrades found out what had happened to Custer's group. To the northeast of where the encampment had been was a grisly scene. Blue-coated bodies were lying all over, many of them scalped or mutilated. On a hilltop known today as Last Stand Hill, George Armstrong Custer's body was found, surrounded by the bodies of his men. He'd been shot twice, in the head and in the heart. Every man he led into battle that day met the same fate. Over 200 in all. The dead included 2 of Custer's brothers, his brother-in-law and his nephew. At only 36 years old, his once brilliant military career had ended in disaster. The news of the defeat and the death of Custer in the Battle of Little Bighorn reached the East Coast during the nation's centennial celebrations and was met with shock and horror by the American public. Libby Custer emerged from her mourning period determined to preserve her late husband's reputation. She believed he'd died a hero and deserved to be recognized as such. She blamed Major Reno and Captain Benteen for the death of her husband, accusing them of cowardice. A court of inquiry held in 1879 found Reno blameless for the defeat, but accusations that he was incompetent or a coward or a drunk dogged him until his death and for many years afterwards. Initially, Custer was buried with his men on the battlefield, but in 1877 his body was exhumed. At least it was believed to be his body. Some historians believed they might have actually dug up the wrong corpse, and it was brought to West Point, where he was reinterred with full military honors in the West Point Cemetery. By that point, the Great Sioux War was over, the victory at the Little Bighorn only delaying the inevitable. Lakota Chief Crazy Horse, who had led his warriors to victory, was compelled to surrender in 1877 and was killed in custody a few months later. Sitting Bull went with his band to Canada and managed to hold out until 1881, when he too was forced to come in. The US government forced the Lakota to give up the Black Hills by threatening to cut off their food supplies on the reservation if they did not comply. Facing starvation, they had no choice. Over 100 years later, in 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that the Black Hills had been illegally taken from the Lakotas. They ordered the United States to compensate the Sioux Nation for its loss, money that the Lakota have refused to take because they never wanted to sell the land in the first place. Libby Custer was her husband's biggest advocate in the decades after Little Bighorn, and is largely responsible for his initial status as the American martyr in the cultural memory of the country. Custer was one of the heroes of the Old West, an essential character in any game of cowboys and Indians, and the story of his last stand became one of the most famous in American history. His character has appeared in at least 30 movies, including by such famous actors as Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan, and many books were written about him, often hagiographic in nature. However, as the United States began to come to grips with the awful tragedy that had been inflicted on American Indians in the 18th and 19th centuries, not only on the Great Plains, but all over the country, people began to view George Custer's life and deeds in a new light. Because he had been so famous, almost mythical, he was singled out for special criticism. Military researchers have concluded that the defeat at Little Bighorn was largely Custer's own fault, that he'd blundered into a situation he didn't fully understand and had gotten himself and his men killed. Whether he did so out of a misguided sense of duty or out of a vainglorious need to heap further laurels upon himself, or a mixture of both, is up for debate. Today, George Custer provides much more mixed reaction than he did 100 years ago. Some have called him a butcher, a callous murderer, accused of killing and raping women and children and using them as human shields. Others claim he was no better or worse than any other white man of the period, that he didn't hate Indians, he just did what his government ordered him to do as an army officer. A few people still consider him to be a hero, and as the years pass and he disappears into the pages of history, it seems unlikely too many people ever will again.